that, interestingly enough, this all works within a 500-year cycle. Actually, every 500 years, approximately, the population of the world explodes, and it basically almost quadruples or more in a century. So these large generational waves of new people, they drive even larger innovation cycles. So if we go back 500 years ago, that's when the printing press was introduced. And really, if you think about it, that was the beginning of the information revolution.
Right. Huh.
And the interesting thing is, and I've tried to explain how big the baby boom generation is, this is the 500-year generation, and that's why it was 5 times bigger than the last generation, and why we had, so much disruptive new technology that has been introduced into the system, and why productivity around the world has increased so radically.
Now, Byron, if you could you clarify something for me? If I understand correctly, the birth rate index would indicate how much future consumer spending would contribute to future economic growth.
Yeah, that absolutely. Okay, these birth charts tell us a lot of information. The average family, okay, in our generation goes through very predictable spending cycles. And the good news is, like I said, it doesn't take a degree in economics to understand any of this.
Right.
On average, we enter the workforce about age 19, and up until now, you've been a cost to the economy as teenagers and students and children. Now, it's really only after people enter the workforce and start receiving some sort of training that these new generations become, well, first, productive workers, and then second, they become consumers who earn and spend money. So as we, or the generation, ages, we earn more and we spend more each and every year, and that's what starts driving more and more economic activity.
Byron, thanks so much for the information today. And I know we're coming up to the end of the podcast, but before we go, for myself and for the listeners, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Well, you know what? What I'm going to do is it's kind of interesting to compare this. Do you remember, and I think a lot of people would remember this, during the 70s, how the Japanese were they were thought of as an economic superpower? Well, it's interesting to note that the Japanese were 2 decades ahead of us with their demographics. So they peaked shortly thereafter World War II in their birth rate. Now, here was a country that was leading the world, and in 1989, their stock market dropped as much as 67%, and that was from a high of about $39,000 and change in around January, I think it was about 1990, and it actually dropped down to about $14,000 in April of 1992. Now, by using these birth charts, Harry Dent was able to predict, which he did back in the early 80s, that Japan would go through this economic trouble. Just like us, they had a stock market boom, they had a real estate bubble, and when those bubbles burst, they had too much debt. Because when you borrow money, you increase the amount of money in the system. When you pay back that money, it actually reduces the amount of money in the system or in the economy. And that's why 20 years later, Japan is still in a deflationary downturn. They've never been able to recover because their demographics or their birth rate dropped so severe. They've had no new generation to start driving economic activity and getting the economy back up and running again.
You know, Byron, great conversation today. I'm so glad that we're able to talk with you about this really fascinating topic of demographics. But unfortunately, today we are out of time. Now, if you know someone who would benefit from what we've talked about today, please go ahead and share this podcast with them. I'm sure they'll thank you for it. Now, remember, you can visit Byron at www.byronstriloff.com. That's www.byronstriloff.com. And you can always reach Byron by telephone at 604-535-3700. Again, that's 604-535-3700. Once again, Byron, for myself and the listeners, thanks so much for the information today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Sound Investing with Byron Striloff. To schedule a face-to-face conversation, you can reach Byron at 604-535-3700. That's 604-535-3700 and online at www.byronstriloff.com.
You're listening to localwebradio.fm.